In today's video, we're going to be continuing our descent into the madness of the Appalachians. If you missed episode 1, go ahead and check up here. In today's video, we guessed the amazing and incredible Donovan Dredd, who's here to share some stories submitted from the Appalachian Mountains. But before we get into today's stories, if you enjoy storytelling of the mysterious and supernatural, be sure to go ahead and hit that big ol' red subscribe button because I release content every other day. Let's go. Now, according to author Lewis Collins, an early settler, General John Payne made a startling discovery while building his house along the Ohio River. The bottom on which the Augusta is situated is a large burying ground of the ancients. They have been found in great numbers and of all sizes, everywhere between the mouths of the Bracken and Locust Creeks, a distance of about a mile and a half. From the cellar under Payne's dwelling, 60 by 70 feet, over 110 skeletons were taken. Barton had measured them by skulls, and there might have been even more whose skulls had crumpled into dust. These skeletons of all sizes were from 7 feet to infant. And David Kilgore, who was a very tall and very large man, had passed the village at the time they were excavating the cellar, and they took him down and applied a thigh bone to his. The man, if well proportioned, must have been at least 12 inches taller than Kilgore, and the lower jawbone alone would still slip on over his, skin and all. So, who were they? How did their bones get here? Adair County from the Louisville Courier Journal, January 30th, 1876, in Columbia, Kentucky, had this to say. Two young men named White, while idly wandering in a large tract of wild, dense forest in the southeastern part of our county, discovered what they supposed to be a sinkhole or fox den, and with that idea proceeded to explore it. After a little trouble in making their way through the entrance, the cave, for such as it proved to be, became large enough to admit of their walking upright. They had proceeded thus in this passage probably 150 yards when they emerged into a large, picturesque gallery, the beauty and grandeur of which will rival that of the old mammoth itself. The room, according to their calculations, is about 150 by 100 feet, and abounds in all the varieties of the stalactite and stalagmites, but it is not the things we naturally expect to find in the caves that we wish to mention particularly, but the curious remains that we discovered therein. The northeast corner of the first gallery, which there are 5 that we speak of, about 5 feet from the ground, they noticed some strange characters or hieroglyphics, neatly carved in the wall, which, upon closer examination, proved to be the head rock of a vault. A few minutes of prying served to loosen this and disclose to view the interior of the enclosure in solid rock of about 5 by 10 feet, which contained the remains of 3 skeletons which measured 8 feet 7.5 inches, 8 feet 5 inches, and 8 feet 4 3/4 inches in length, respectively. The heads were lying toward the east, with each body parallel to the other. Beside them lay 3 huge, or what looked to be, swords, but they were so decayed that upon being touched, they crumpled to dust. After examining the remains closely, but finding nothing that would serve to throw any light on the question as to who and from whence they are, they closed the vault, but in doing so knocked their torch out, which they had contrived before entering, leaving them in anything but a pleasant predicament. After searching some time for their lost treasure, they concluded to try to escape by feeling their way out, but this made the matter worse. They stated that after leaving the first large room, they struck a good-sized branch, and continued following it until forced to turn into another passage, the stream disappearing suddenly in a huge, perpendicular gulch, which led them into another spacious hall, the size of which they believed to be quite as large as the first. Out of this second opening, and through what they conceived to be 3 others, similar at least in size, their way seemed to gradually ascend, until their hearts were made glad by the discovery of light ahead, and finally emerged from their ugly confinement through a hole about midway, the cliff of Russell's Creek, having been confined in their subterranean discovery over 38 hours. The whole country thereabouts is rife with speculations concerning the interesting discovery, and numbers of citizens will visit it as soon as the messengers will. The above that I've just read is a correct account and may be replied on, as the young men are unimpeachable veracity. According to the Adair County News, on January 5th, 1858, an old native mound located on the farm of one Harrison Robinson was excavated and yielded giant human skeletal remains as well. The late Michael Paul Henson, well-known Kentucky writer and folklorist, wrote In Tragedy at Devil's Hollow and Other Kentucky Ghost Stories. This details another bizarre skeleton found at Holly Creek, Kentucky, Breathitt County in 1965, which he was personally able to examine. A man named Kenneth White, while constructing cattle stalls under a large overhanging rock ledge near his home, came upon the perfectly preserved skeletal remains of what he at first took to be a native, as it was buried facing east, a well-known Native American custom. Noticing some atypical aspects of the burial, White had asked Henson to help further examine the strange bones, which were covered with a peculiar white powdery substance that disappeared when touched. Upon reassembling the bones, the two were amazed to find that the unusual fellow in life had stood at least almost 9 feet tall. Moreover, the arms were abnormally long with large hands, while the feet of the being seemed small by comparison. The skull measured an astounding 30 inches in circumference, just 6 inches shy of a full yard. But the most unusual aspect of the skeleton was the facial structure, the likes of which neither had ever seen before or even heard of. The eye and nose sockets were slits rather than cavities, and the area where the jawbone hinges to the skull was solid bone. Seemingly, this creature had never been able to open its mouth to eat or speak. No weapons, tools, or clothing remains were found in association with the bones, which, according to Henson's account, occupied a position 5 feet below ground, indicating that they had been placed there at least 300 years prior to their discovery. Strangely, Henson related that the burial site looked only a few days old, with no sign of dark-colored soil, usually associated with the decaying of human tissue. The two assumed the remains were those of an extraordinarily large, deformed man. In the same area, some 20 years prior, a 60-pound double-edged stone axe and a 20-inch flint blade were plowed up by a local farmer. White had later reburied the peculiar bones, and no official examination of them was ever conducted. Unfortunately, Henson died in March of 1995 without ever disclosing the exact location of this burial site. The following story was shared with me by an anonymous submitter who had went hiking along the Appalachian Trail. Their experience took place back in 2017 in Kentucky, and they would like to preface that they were hiking with a group of friends and they all saw the exact same thing. Something to this very day they can't quite understand. Now, this eyewitness had grown up in the city, so the woods were always a bit of an enigma, but they loved them all the same. There was just something about being one with nature that just called out to them. So, when their friends had suggested they all go on a hike, our eyewitness was down for it. By the way, the friends and them would often like to hike the Appalachian trails together, so this experience was really nothing new. Or so they thought it would be. What they encountered that morning was something they would not expect. The day started off just fine as any would. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, but as they got further along into their journey, something began to feel off. The woods became eerily quiet and the air felt thick and heavy. And out of nowhere, they could hear this blood-curdling scream. It sounded like a woman being tortured. They would all freeze up, all getting goosebumps, and felt like you could cut the tension in the air with a knife. Our eyewitness would like to state that they know what a mountain lion sounds like, but this was completely different. It reminded him of something much larger, much more guttural. Before they could even think or process what was happening, they began to hear something large tearing through the woods north towards their direction. It was hard for him to give an estimate of how far away it was, just because the way sound naturally travels in the woods. But they did not stand around to find out. They took off running and stated that it sounded like whatever it was now following them, pursuing them in that same direction. They state that they made it probably a quarter mile before they all had to stop and catch their breaths, noting that they're not exactly in shape, so it took them a while to get this far into the hike. As they're sitting there trying to catch their breath, they could hear something, now not crashing through the woods anymore, but sneakily and clandestinely trying to sneak through the woods to get to them. It was as if someone was trying to sneak up on them. So our eyewitness taps on his friend's shoulder, pointing towards the woodline where they're hearing the noise, asking him if he hears that, because they can now hear that whoever or whatever this was now getting closer to the opening of the woodline, where it just slowly inched out enough to where they can now visibly see this figure. Although slight and subtle, what they saw scared all of them. Our eyewitness states that even though he did not get the best look at it, they could tell it was humongous and had a large pointed snout and ears. They wanted to reiterate that before we all write this off as simply a bear misidentification, he wanted to make it known that he knows what a black bear looks like and that this did not look like a bear. This was distinctly canine on a human body full of rippling muscles. They didn't stick around. They took off running and did not stop until they got back. Now, he notes that this experience has stuck with him for years now, and every time he tries to make sense of it and tries to rationalize it as maybe it was a misidentification or maybe it was exhaustion, there has to be a reason that they saw what they did, because it clearly didn't make any sense, but there's nothing that can explain it. And between all of them corroborating the exact same details, what can you say? With the end of that story, it leads us into a journey into South Central Kentucky. On a sunny morning in May of 1997, Barton Nunnally's brother Dean and him set out to explore for the first time a few of the mysterious locations which were situated deep within the rugged forest of South Central Kentucky. Their base of operations was his home in Summer Shade, Metcalfe County, where he and his family had moved only a short time before. After spending the previous night there at his home and going over plans, they arose that next morning, armed themselves with handguns and bowie knives, 2 wilderness exploration essentials, and drove to the nearby Cumberland County. Their plan was to drive as far as possible along a dirt access road and proceed on foot to a certain interesting area that Barton's brother had discovered a few weeks previously, but had not been able to properly explore at the time. Of particular note was a cave he'd found filled with old bones and flint shards. He and Barton shared a mutual fascination with all places and things associated with Native American Indians since they were small children, walking between the rows of corn which grew on the ridges in the bottomlands of Henderson County. That and the promise of adventure had always proved irresistible to both of them. Turning off the main road, they ascended windingly up the side of an impressive hill and down into the wide, shallow stream bed below. The sunshine glistened and glimmered on the clear running water as they drove through and up onto a narrow road to begin another ascent. After repeating the process several more times, the hills now became thickly forested, boulder-strewn mountains that soared upwards to their left. They had driven a couple of miles further when Barton had told him to stop the vehicle. He had spotted what looked like the perfect spot for a possible cave in the mountainside, roughly 75 feet above them. Pulling over as best he could in a limited space, they set about finding an easy way up. This was soon afforded to them in the form of a small stream that meandered down the mountainside. They both climbed the stream bed until they were level with the large boulders that Barton had seen from below, then set off in their direction. In the shadow of the rock shelters, they had found 2 caves, both the openings inexplicably blocked by well-placed stones of from 20 to 50 pounds each. They knew that it would take several hours to displace the stones, and they had other sites to explore. So, both Barton and his brother decided to save this formidable task for another day and continued on their way to the site that the brother wished to show Barton. This turned out to be a dynamic limestone site. The entrance to the cave was nearly filled in with mud and flint rock, so it was necessary to crawl on your bellies for about 5 yards over the jagged edges of these stones. Many of them were worked, that Barton had noticed, into the crude blades, and the edges were still fairly sharp. The crawl space had opened up into a good-sized chamber, large enough to actually stand up in and move around. Old bones were littered on the rocky floor. Above their heads, they saw a circular tunnel of solid stone of about 15 feet, in diameter, of course, covered with stalagmites and a few bats. That reached upwards into the darkness for at least 25 feet. So Barton throws a stone up and over the ledge, and judging by the sound of the echoes, that another chamber was directly above them. Curiously, along the back of the cave wall were 2 branching tunnels which had been blocked, just as in the first location, with large, heavy stones that had obviously been brought in from outside the cave. On subsequent visits to the 2 sites, these stones were removed and the tunnel entrances revealed, although they turned out to be uncomfortably overcramped and so remain largely unexplored by anyone to Barton's knowledge. The overhead tunnel proved inaccessible and still retains all of its initial mystery. A couple of projectile points from the archaic period were found in these locations which seemed otherwise unremarkable, at least the parts they could see. They carefully inspected the sites for signs of any modern human activity and could find none. No discarded soda cans, cigarette butts, or candy wrappers or other miscellaneous garbage. No discarded or spent shell casings. Not even a hastily scrawled set of initials on any of the cavern walls. His last venture into the wilds of south central Kentucky was in 2001. He had been largely unsuccessful in his attempts at gathering further information regarding the Littlefoot creatures, and so decided to spend his remaining time in the area exploring the many creeks and mountainsides. They both drove to a location that was several miles from the cave sites, took up their walking sticks, knives, and handguns, and set off down a rocky creek bed in the middle of nowhere, miles from any apparent signs of civilization. Barton and brother decided they'd like to know what was on the other side of one particular mountain that they were passing. So, soon, they came upon what looked like cairns. 6 or 8 good-sized rocks stacked together one atop the other, spaced around every 20 yards or so, standing about 2 feet high. They had no idea who made them nor what they signified, so they continued on to the summit, breaking out of the woodline onto a series of peaceful-looking meadows. These were also constructed one atop the other, diminishing in size as they rose. The whole thing strongly resembled the many step pyramids of South America and other places they'd seen in pictures of books. They stood there, Barton and brother, and took it all in before descending once again to the creek and continuing onward. They were about 3 miles into the trek, walking along down the middle of a stream, taking care not to step on a water moccasin or timber rattler, when they began finding the curious stones. They lay in and along the creek bed by the tens of thousands, meticulously crafted by unknown hands for unknown purposes in a variety of geometric shapes, the most common being the wedge shape and the wedge within a wedge variation. In size, they ranged from just about a few ounces to upwards of 20 pounds or so, and came in every color, utilizing in their construction every available local material. Barton and brother examined many of the strange rocks and could only conclude that they were fashioned in such a manner which allowed them to be placed together piece by piece, like an ancient stony puzzle, to form walls or, at the very least, one long wall of rock. This was exciting. They had both read the North American legends of strange creatures, fierce 10-foot-tall giants who supposedly inhabited all the lands east of the Mississippi River thousands of years ago. It was claimed that this race was white-skinned, had 12 fingers and 12 toes each, and a double row of teeth. They were completely evil, existing only to kill. Could it be possible this was the Nephilim? Also mentioned was that the idea that these white devils constructed houses and walls of stone. After a lengthy and very bloodthirsty war, they were finally killed or driven away, and toppling all of their houses and walls until there was not a single stone standing. They were standing in such a location which had remained virtually unchanged for thousands of years. The evidence of such a staggering number of worked stones certainly appeared to support the notion that these rocks once comprised of walls and structures of some sort. No Native American tribe that frequented the area in the distant past, to Barton's knowledge, was known to build and inhabit stone dwellings. It was an intriguing concept, to be sure, but one that they could not confirm. They had found no writings or markings of any type on any of the stones they examined, nor on any of the nearby limestone cliffs. No projectile points or any other artifacts could be discovered to possibly shed some light on this strange mystery. There was also nothing to implicate any culture in known American history to this particular mystery site. They searched the immediate area, but came up empty-handed. Barton would have given a pretty penny at the moment to have been able to view an undamaged and intact example of this architecture. A couple of hours later, on the return trip back down the creek, he got his chance, and it was completely by accident. They had stopped for a brief rest, and as he sat there among the ferns on the creek bank, he heard the sound of faintly running water behind him. He turns to look, but saw nothing, so he gets up to investigate. Now, a couple of seconds later, he's staring down at an enclosure which had been built around a natural spring of cold, fresh water, which bubbled gently from the ground. It was rectangular, entirely with square-cut stones, and measured some 7 feet long by 4 feet wide by 3 feet deep. Sunk just in front of the springs was a large, flat, black, smooth stone, which is what Barton refers to as a footstone. 2 feet above this, and slightly behind it, a long square beam of roughly about a foot wide and about 7 inches thick was set into the walls. He calls these the seat stone, and it looked to be positioned to serve as a crude chair, perhaps to rest the ancient traveler while he drank his fill. The bottom of the structure was open-ended, allowing for the trickle of spring water to flow out of the enclosure, and capped with a lentil stone, which was only slightly smaller than the seat stone and of similar appearance. All the rocks used in its construction appeared to be similar in size, and about 14 inches long, 4 inches wide, and about 5 inches thick. They were well placed, mortarless, and covered with the moss of countless ages. Who had constructed this mysterious well? Could this be convincing evidence of the truthfulness of these strange creature legends, after whom the Allegheny Mountains were supposedly named? Who can say? Barton sat down in the structure, bent, and drank from the ice-cold, crystal-clear mountain spring just had members of the mysterious, possibly pre-native culture did ages ago, taking film footage of the entire area for later reference. The time had come to leave south-central Kentucky and make the return trip to his home in the western portions of the state. As he endured the 3-hour drive, he had not only the Littlefoot mystery to contemplate, but also another one concerning the Commonwealth's truly mysterious peoples of the ancient past.
Hi, Donovan. Thanks for speaking with me about my encounter. I've included everything in this email. This took place in July of 2019, when my wife and I decided to spend some time in the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky, specifically Pine Mountain State Resort Park. We stayed in one of their cottages. We love the outdoors, however, we don't like sleeping in tents. This was a great trip for us because we went hiking and I got to play 2 rounds of golf too. Now that our youngest kid went off to college, the wife and I like going on these little trips as much as we can. Our first day there, we went hiking most of the day and everything was fine. We had a wonderful time. The second day, we played golf in the afternoon and then had a fire outside of our lodge that night. That's when it happened. We just finished dinner around 8 p.m. We had a late dinner, and then I started a fire. It was around 9 p.m. at night when I heard this strange noise. It was a very high-pitched sound, like an industrial sound of heavy equipment or something like that. I looked over at my wife, who was sitting in her chair about 10 feet away from the fire, and I noticed her eyes were locked onto this tree line right near the edge of the creek across from our lodge. I followed her eyes and I saw this weird light, like a bright giant flashlight coming down from the tree line, and it was approaching us. I stood up to see what was going on. At first, I thought it might be a blimp or a lit up hot air balloon, but then as it got closer, I noticed it was oval shaped, and it was just hovering over us, shining this very bright light down into the trees. The noise at this point was pulsating in my ears. I looked over at my wife and she says, "We need to go inside." The look on her face was fear. She was legitimately scared of whatever was happening at that moment. It felt like we were under attack or something bad was going to happen. You know how you get that feeling in your stomach when something just doesn't feel right? That's how I felt standing there looking at this thing. I started walking back towards the lodge and I took out my phone and snapped a couple pictures before this took off into the sky. As I was standing there watching this ship or whatever it was hovering over the trees, it takes off into the sky like a rocket was being launched. Definitely the strangest thing I've ever seen. The next day we asked around if anyone saw what we saw, and there were 2 other couples in the lodges that said they saw the same thing that we did. That had to be a UFO or some type of government experiment, like a high-tech plane or something. Thanks for reading my story.
If you guys enjoyed today's episode, be sure to go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button for more content just like this one as we continue our episode with Barton Nunnally. Be sure to go ahead and leave a comment down below because I love hearing from you guys. And as always, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll catch you guys in the very next episode.